Testing.
Testing.
Oh, you're making. No, it's on. It's on and it's on. It might be muted. It could be muted. It was on earlier.
Jane and Bruce, can you hear me? Barely? Do you have a mic too, or are you using? Okay.
It's just not coming through. Let me go see if Bryce is here.
Amplifier's on. I turned on the amplifier. It says it's on. Is it something manual, maybe?
It's definitely picking up sound.
Yeah,
It's just not coming through.
it's definitely. What is? As if he plugged into the monitor port and plugged it. If he plugged into the monitor port and then Ronnie?
Testing, testing.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. All right, here we go, folks. Take it away, Ronnie.
Thank you, Bryce, wherever you went. Okay. Question. How many of you know that this church is a certified green church? Well, okay. I'm done. Okay, well, just quickly, Rex and I started working on this pretty soon after he got here. And every year, the Presbyterians have this list of things we have to accomplish in order to continue our green church fame. And one of the areas that is required is that we have an educational program. And so Avery tonight is our biggest and best educator we could find in this field to really give us a sense of what he's seeing from churches and communities all around the country as he tries to educate all of us about what the scriptures say about preserving our wonderful earth and what we all need to continue to do and hopefully do a better job of in the future to keep our earth where we want to live. Did I miss anything? Rex? Where's Rex? I lost him. Okay, so without further ado, I am turning the microphone over to our distinguished interim senior pastor.
Thank you. Please hold the applause. And please don't take my notes, because I...
These are yours.
Yes, they are. No. Thank you. These here are yours. These are yours. Thank you. All right. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Avery Davis Lamb. Some of you know that Avery is a longtime acquaintance of both me and my wife. He is one of my son's best friends. I've known him since he was 11. So there's a lot of stuff about you I know, Avery. Yeah, so, but he's all grown up now. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He's the executive director of Creation Justice Ministries, which is a national organization which works with 39 Christian denominations on environmental injustice issues. Avery has a background in both ecological research and faith-based environmental organizing, studying ecology and various ecosystems and organizing faith communities across the country in support of action on environmental justice. Previously, he has worked for Sojourners and Interfaith Power and Light. He serves on the board of the Center for Spirituality and Nature and is a fellow with an organization called Regenerate, the Regenerate program at Wake Forest Divinity School, and the Foundations of Christian Leadership program at Duke Divinity School. He has a Bachelor's of Arts in Biology and Sustainability from Pepperdine University, a Master of Environmental Management in Ecosystem Science and Conservation. I gotta catch my breath. With a certificate in Community-Based Environmental Management from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University, and a Master of Theological Studies with a certificate in Faith, Food, and Environmental Justice from Duke Divinity School. His research focuses on the role of religious communities in building climate resilience and adaptation, with emphasis on the virtue of climate hospitality, which we'll learn more about forthwith. Let us all welcome Avery.
Thanks, Scott. Can you all hear me all right? No microphone issues here? Great. Yeah, Scott and I have known each other for a long time. One of the stories that comes to mind is my junior year of high school. We went on a big college trip to the Northeast, and we had intended to stop somewhere between Topeka and Philadelphia overnight to sleep. But all of the hotels were booked because there was a deer hunting conference, and so Scott drove us through the night from Topeka, Kansas to Philadelphia. And so I know that you're in good hands. He's a great driver, even on no sleep, and so I know you're in good hands. You'll see tonight the subtitle of my presentation is Seeing the World as Creation. And for some reason that might have to do with what my right eye looks like. I've been thinking a lot about eyesight this week, and despite what looks like a bar fight, it was actually just me learning that using my face to clean my bathroom floor is not a very effective mode to do that. So we'll get back to the eyesight piece in just a bit, but first I want to share a little bit about our work at Creation Justice Ministries. And I'll start by sharing about the three pillars of our work. So like Scott said, we work ecumenically across 39 denominations and work nationally. And our work is to educate Christians to understand the interconnections between faith and the environment, to equip leaders to build creation-conscious cultures in their communities, and to mobilize advocates to change systems in their communities and nationwide. And here's our mission. We educate, equip, and mobilize Christian individuals, churches, and denominations or communions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. And I want to zoom in a little bit on that last piece, the protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Sometimes I like to think of that triad as the three E's of our work. That the work of protection that we do is ecological, right? We're working to love and protect God's good creation and the ways that we see and encounter God through creation. Rightly share is economic, knowing that in the abundance of God's world, there's enough to go around, but so often in our human structures, we're not sharing God's abundance equally. And restore, which is eschatological, which is this. I think you'll hear more about eschatology next week, so I won't get into it too much, but this idea that we are working towards the restoration of all things. And that our work right now, even as we look toward the end, toward the eschaton, our work right now is to partner with God in the restoration of all things. And then to add to the three E's, a fourth E, our work is ecumenical, which means we work across Christian traditions, from Baptists to Orthodox and everywhere in between. I'm sure you all are familiar with John 1, in the beginning was the Word. As we start here, I want to begin with a word that ties together these four E's. And that word is the Greek word oikos. Does anyone recognize this word? Maybe on a Greek yogurt container. That's probably where. Anyone know what this word means, other than it's really good Greek yogurt? It means household. It's the Greek word for household. But it's also the root word that is often translated as eco. So it's where ecology comes from, economy, and ecumenical. So three of our four E's have to do with God's household, with the understanding and the structuring of this household of God that we live in. And I share this because the work of creation justice for us is not just the work of caring for something that is out there, something that is other than human life, but it's about caring for the household of God, which is all around us and which we participate in. And that oikos, God's household, necessarily weaves together the ecological, the economic, and the ecumenical, right? Everyone is involved. All of these themes that we see come alive in Scripture. And the same is true for economy. I think economy is a bit of an easier one to wrap our heads around, right? God's justice has to do, like I said, with how we share or don't share the gifts of God's creation. I want to dig into ecology a little bit too. What's the connection between ecology and Scripture? Well, the term ecology was coined in 1866, which it's one of the newer sciences because of that, really, and clearly, centuries after the time that the Bible is being written. But ecology simply put a name and a framework on a lot of the perspectives that we encounter in Scripture. A lot of these perspectives that the indigenous, close to the land, agrarian writers of the Bible knew well. Ecology at a fundamental level is the study of the interaction between organisms and their environments. For Western science, which had undertaken since really the Enlightenment the project of dualism and reductionism, this new framework of ecology was a breakthrough, and we're receiving the benefits of that breakthrough in Western science. But really, ecology is an attempt to return to the ways of knowing that people living close to the land have held for millennia. These stories of God, the stories of humanity, stories of the land that we encounter in Scripture can be understood as ecological stories. They're written by people who lived close to the land, and they track the story of a God who loves creation and wants to draw ever closer and closer to it. So to read these texts in their truest sense is to read them as ecological texts, as words that carry good news for this good creation. I want to share specifically about one ecological concept, and that's the concept of coevolution. Coevolution, this is the scientific definition of coevolution. Coevolution occurs when interacting species undergo reciprocal evolutionary change, with each adapting in response to the traits, behaviors, or presence of the other. In other words, coevolution is when two living things change over time because they're responding to each other, not just responding to the environment that they live in. So here's a local example that you all probably have seen, and that's the relationship between oysters and mangroves. So over the course of the history of this ecosystem here in Southwest Florida, mangroves and oysters have co-evolved together. Mangroves send down their tangled prop roots into the brackish water, and oysters have adapted to attach themselves to these roots that then form living reefs. The oysters filter the water, they improve the water quality, they stabilize the sediment around the mangroves, and in turn, the mangroves slow the water and create the conditions that the oysters need to survive. Over time, over millennia of these creatures living and co-evolving with each other, each has shaped the other's ability to thrive. So they're not just independently living side by side, they're actually becoming who they are together. And I think any of us who are in relationships, especially marital relationships, might understand that coevolution doesn't just happen in nature with mangroves and oysters, right? We co-evolve with each other. We're shaped by the people who we are in long-term relationship with. I also think we can understand Scripture and nature as being in a kind of relationship of coevolution. The landscapes, the seasons, the waters, and the creatures of the biblical world shaped how the biblical authors wrote those scriptures and how the people within those stories experience God. Scripture itself is full of deserts and rivers, vineyards and fig trees, storms and droughts, and these aren't merely background scenery for the drama of humanity, but all of that nature is actually an active participant in the life of Scripture. And at the same time, Scripture shapes how we read the world. So the stories, the metaphors, the promises of the text train our attention. It teaches us how to notice creation, how to listen to it, how to interpret our own experiences within it. So when we read Scripture, we're not just learning about God independent of the rest of creation. We're actually learning how to see nature as charged with meaning, charged with agency and relationship. We learn how to see nature as creation. So much of this turn depends upon how we see. So back to my eyesight. I want to tell you a story. My uncle was an optometrist, He just recently retired, but I loved visiting him in his office. He lived in Branson, Missouri, and we would often go and visit him in Branson and go into his office on the weekend when no one else was in there, and he would test all of our eyes, all of my family. I loved it too because I got to play with the wooden train set out in the waiting area where the rest of my family was getting their eyes checked. But whenever my cousins and I would pretend to be Uncle Rick, which happened a lot because we loved Uncle Rick and we thought being an eye doctor was really cool, we would say in exactly his cadence, lens 1 or lens 2, right? Lens 1 or lens 2. And he'd ask us, right, which is the clearer lens? Lens 1 or lens 2? And the experience was so visceral to me. I still feel it. It's with lens 1, it's blurry, it's clouded. It almost feels physically unsettling to look through that. And then finally, lens 2, the clarity that we get. We are always looking at the world through lenses. Especially when we look at nature, we apply all sorts of lenses. One of my seminary professors would often say, there is no such thing as uninterpreted nature. We're always looking at nature, whether it's a tree or a flower or a patch of soil. We're looking at it through, click, lens 1, our experiences, click, lens 2, our cultures, lens 3, the beliefs that we carry, right? All of these lenses that help us make sense of what we see. That same seminary professor has a thought experiment that I also want to share with you and that I'm going to need your help with. I want you all to pretend you're holding a plant. It can be any plant for now. Just conjure in your mind that you're holding a plant. Now, what if I tell you that this plant is a flower? How do you respond? You smell it? It smells pretty good. Maybe you look at it. Pretty. Maybe you, if there's enough there, you clip it and you take it home and you put it in a vase on the kitchen table. Okay, now what if that plant that you're holding turns into a fruit? What do? You take a bite. Yeah, it's tasty, it's delicious. Yeah, it's an amazing apple. Okay, now what if I tell you that plant that you're holding is a weed? Gardeners in the house, what do? Yeah, we pull it out and we throw it in the compost, or if it's particularly invasive, we throw it in the trash can so it doesn't get its seeds everywhere else, right? Okay, what we call nature, how we see nature, affects our relationship to nature, right? If we see nature as a flower, we're going to behave in a certain way. If we see it as a fruit or a weed, we're going to behave in a different way. So what happens when we see the world as creation? Seeing the world as creation is a distinctly, though not exclusively, Christian way of seeing the world. It's seeing the world as a gift from God. But there are other ways of seeing the world that are very dominant in our world and in our culture. One way of seeing the world is seeing the world as a warehouse, right? A place that is intended for humans to kind of a set of resources that we can take and use for our own life. Or seeing the world as a wilderness, a place that is entirely separate and set apart from human life. But this other way, this way of seeing the world as creation, is to enter into a story where God is drawing ever closer to this gift and where God is inviting us and all of the other creatures around us into more intimate communion with that world. It's not a world like the warehouse, where humans are the only creatures that matter, nor is it a world like the wilderness, where humans are supposed to just let nature thrive out on its own, but it's a world where humanity is intimately tied up with the life of the world, the life of nature, the life of creation. And what do we have as guides for how to see the world as creation, for how to train, to focus those lenses in the world as creation? Well, one of the guides that we have is Scripture. The work of a life of faith, and I'm learning more and more that it is truly lifetime work, is to bring the way that we see the world in alignment with the way God sees the world. To adjust the lens of our perception so that its focal length draws ever closer and closer to the focal length of God. And to follow the life and example of Jesus Christ as the standard upon which we measure that focal length. Our tradition is one where, as we discussed, creation and Scripture are in this intimate interplay with each other, this coevolution with each other. I didn't just make this up. St. Augustine is credited with a saying that I'm sure you all have heard before, that there are two books, right? There's the book of Scripture, and there's the book of nature. And there's also what a lot of us now call general revelation, that Scripture is special revelation, and then there's general revelation, the way God is revealed through nature. And as Paul writes in the letter to the Romans, ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been seen and understood through the things God has made. We read Scripture better when we read it with nature, and we read nature better when we read it with Scripture. Or as one of my favorite authors, Wendell Berry, puts it, the Bible is a book open to the sky. It is best read and understood outdoors, and the farther outdoors, the better. Passages that within walls seem improbable or incredible, outdoors seem nearly natural. And this is because outdoors we are confronted everywhere with wonders. We see that the miraculous is not extraordinary, but the common mode of existence. The Bible is a book best read and understood outdoors. We're not outdoors right now, thankfully. I think we'd be a little cold today. But I think we can pretend that we're outdoors. I'm going to guide us through a few guideposts of Scripture, just a few prominent stops in the story that's all about God's relationship with His good creation. So this very short journey is not intended to be exhaustive, because that would be exhausting for you all, but just a few stops along the way for us to read the Scriptures alongside nature. I also intended to share this lovely picture of mangroves and oysters with you. So enjoy this now, though I would imagine it's a familiar sight. And we're going to start at the beginning. Why not? Starting with Genesis 1 and 2. What do creation stories do? I think creation stories help us make sense of why we are here. I don't think they're typically very good at helping us understand how we are here, but they give us some tools to understand why we are here. They orient us toward what is most important in our lives. And one of my favorite things about the tradition that we are in, the Christian tradition, but also the Abrahamic tradition, is that we have two creation stories. And I think that the two complement each other really well. Of course, we have the Genesis 1 story, and this one is more systematic. Each day this happened, it's all about the goodness of creation. God created and called it good. God created and called it good. God created and called it good. Right? It's this heartbeat of goodness all through Genesis 1. The Hebrew word for good in this section is a word, it's tov, which is, it gets beyond just the kind of flippant way that we tend to use good in our vernacular. It's this deep, abiding goodness, like the kind of goodness that makes life possible. Every day of creation is this deep, deep, abiding goodness. And then, at the peak of creation, what does God do? What does God do at the peak of creation? Maybe you thought, create humans. But that's actually before the peak of creation. The peak of creation is the Sabbath. when God steps back and rests and delights in the goodness of creation. Right? Here is a God that created, yes, ex nihilo, out of nothing, but also ex amore, out of love. God didn't have to create, but God created in order to love this good, beautiful world. And then, at the peak of it all, stops to rest and delight in its goodness. The Genesis 2 story is completely different, right? Where does the Genesis 2 story take place? It takes place in a garden, right? God is depicted as a gardener. And as much as I love resting and Sabbathing and delighting in God's creation, I think I like the Genesis 2 story more. And it's probably because I'm also a gardener. I feel like God and I sort of understand each other here. I grew up in the church, but some of my most memorable, informative spiritual experiences happened when after church I changed into my play clothes and I went out and I worked in the garden with my mom. And from many conversations that I've had with church people, I don't think I'm unique in that. I think that for many people, we encounter God in the garden more than we do in the walls of the church. Who are the gardeners here? Anyone else feel like that's where you encounter God? Yeah. And the authors of this Genesis 2 account probably felt the same. These were subsistence farmers. Every day, the context of their life was in the soil. They quite literally co-evolved with the life of the land. It nurtured them even as they nurtured it. So it makes sense that in this story, God is portrayed as a gardener. And how does God create the world as a gardener? Well, God bends down into the soil and scoops it up and breathes into that soil the breath of life. And out of that soil, breath of life concoction, God creates the first human, Adam, or the Adam. The Adam that was created from the soil, the Hebrew word for which is Adamah. Adam from Adamah. We have actually a really lovely English corollary of this, which is the human from the humus. This first creature, which the literal translation of Adam would be dirtling or earthling. Right? This story, this prototypical story of the first human that tells us that human life is intimately connected to the life of the soil. And the human identity cannot be understood apart from its relation to the soil, or, in verse 15, when God commands Adam to till it and to keep it. I think we read that verse a little bit differently in our era now of how we do agriculture. But a translation of this that I really like that comes from Ellen Davis is till and keep is to serve and observe. The keep there is the same word in the Lord bless you and keep you, right? It is kind of an attentive gardening relationship. So God's act of creation, it's an intimate relationship with the soil, with humanity. And so God and humanity and the land are all intertwined. I want to share this photo with you all, which is from, we offer these trainings at Creation Justice Ministries called Christian Leadership for a Climate Changed World. We bring faith leaders together and we help them grapple with the struggles of leading in a time that is shaped by climate change. When we do these trainings for faith leaders, one of the things that we often invite them to do is to consider their eco-autobiography. We ask them to reflect on the question, how were you shaped by the land where you come from? How are you shaped by both its beauty and by its wounds? For me, an important story in my own eco-autobiography is the story of the Coffeyville, Kansas flood in 2007. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and the summer after my 7th grade year, I spent the summer with my aunt in Coffeyville, Kansas, which is a town of probably 5,000 people. I was starring as Mr. Tumnus in the local community college production of the Chronicles of Narnia. But aside from Mr. Tumnus, what I remember most that summer is that just a month before I'd gotten there was a 500-year flood had occurred in that area. It was the Neosho River that rose higher than it ever had in memory. One of the primary employers in Coffeyville, Kansas, is a crude oil refinery. And the workers failed to shut off the valves at the crude oil refinery, such that when the floodwaters came, 40,000 gallons of crude oil poured out of the refinery into the water. So this was the image of what the flood looked like months before I got there. And then all through that summer, I have such visceral images of exactly this, of houses with the oil watermark 4 or 5 feet up, and then X's spray painted on the doors, condemning them. This was a story of decreation, a story of God's good world come undone. We read in the prophets many such stories like this, stories of the land being laid waste. One of the most piercing examples of the prophets and their relationship to the land comes in Jeremiah 4. Jeremiah cries out in this chapter, my anguish, I writhe in pain. Disaster overtakes disaster. The whole land is laid waste. For my people are foolish, they do not know me. They're stupid children, they have no understanding. They are skilled in doing evil, but do not know how to do good. I looked on the earth, and it was complete chaos, and to the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and there was no one at all, and all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. My anguish, I writhe in pain. Disaster overtakes disaster. The whole land is laid waste. These are lines that probably many of you are familiar with. Maybe it's the feeling of assessing the damage to a house after a hurricane has struck. Other experiences of disasters that you've had. Climate activist and Methodist Sunday school teacher, as he describes himself, Bill McKibben, often describes climate change as running Genesis in reverse. That slowly we're turning back the clock on creation. And I think that's what we see in this passage of Jeremiah as well. A prophet who is seeing Genesis running in reverse. Right? Disaster overtaking disasters, the birds fleeing, the mountains are no more. And the lamentation and the grief of this passage. Yes, it's the lamentation of Jeremiah, but the beauty of the prophets is that it's also the lamentation and the grief of a God, of our God who's mourning and lamenting the destruction of the land. The connection too here, in that injustice on the people also means injustice on the land. We see this throughout the Hebrew prophets, the agrarian prophets of Jeremiah, of Hosea, of Amos, of when the people are treating each other poorly, the land suffers. The human justice is intimately connected to creation justice. So then where are we headed? Where is redemption possible in a fallen world where disaster overtakes disaster? And what are we to do in a world where we constantly fall short of loving and healing and restoring God's creation. Yes, the prophets give voice to our grief, this visceral feeling of looking out upon floodwaters and destruction, and yet, at the same time, Jeremiah holds a vision of restoration, the vision of a world that is made whole. In chapter 33 of the book of Jeremiah, he speaks, "In this place of which you say, it is a waste, in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, these streets that are desolate without inhabitants, human or animal, there shall once more be heard the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness." Even in the midst of the grief, Jeremiah has a vision of a restored world, of a restored temple. This is what the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann means when he writes of the prophetic imagination of the Hebrew prophets. The prophetic imagination is their capacity to help people see the world as it really is and to imagine that it could be otherwise. Prophetic imagination has these two intertwined movements, this double helix of movements. One is the movement of criticism, of telling the truth about what is broken and telling it clearly. And the other is this energizing hope, imagining a different future. In the first, in the criticism, the prophets dismantle the dominant story of a society, the dominant story that the society tells about itself, especially stories of stability, of progress, control, stories of divine approval. They name injustice, they name denial, they name false security. They give voice to the grief that the empire tries to suppress. And this is why often the prophets sound harsh. They sound poetic, they sound emotional, they sound unstable in a lot of ways. And the vision of decreation in Jeremiah 4 is a classic example of this. It breaks the illusion that everything is fine. In the second move, the move of energizing hope, the prophets evoke a kind of hope that is not just optimism. It's not this idea that everything is just going to turn out all right, but it's a grounded hope. It's a costly hope. They imagine a future that is shaped by God's faithfulness rather than by human power. They use concrete images that we can actually imagine in our mind's eye, land that is replanted, cities that are restored, justice flowing, neighbors that are reconciled with each other. It's a hope that is rooted in God's covenantal commitment to the world. And this hope holds, that even in the midst of the world as it is, a world where the land is laid waste and disaster overtakes disaster, another world is possible. If Jeremiah gives us language for grief and for imagining a world made whole again, then baptism, the sacrament and act of baptism, gives us a way to enter into that world with our bodies. I love the story of the baptism of Jesus. To me, it's one of the most creation-soaked moments in the Gospels. And maybe that's because it is a story that happens outside. It happens in a river, right? It's not a baptism in a sanctuary. It's in the Jordan that you could imagine is thick with silt, that there's fish brushing past the ankles of Jesus and John the Baptist. There's mosquitoes buzzing in the heat, probably being really annoying. John and Jesus stand waist deep in this living water, this literal water of life. And then when Jesus emerges, the Spirit descends, not as some abstracted, disembodied spirit, right, but like a dove. God shows up through the life of an animal. Creation is not just the backdrop of the drama of Jesus' baptism here, but creation is a participant. The water is both witness to this and an agent in the act of baptism. According to the Didache, which is one of the earliest Christian teaching documents, baptism ought to happen in cold, living water whenever possible. Not stagnant water, not contained water, living water. Water that moves, water that carries risk, water that reminds us that we are not in control. I was baptized for the first time when I was 5 years old. I was dunked in a small font at First Southern Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. And baptism was framed for me as an assurance of salvation. It was framed as an insurance policy for the afterlife. Part of why I got baptized when I was 5, we did believer's baptism in the Southern Baptist Church. But I really just didn't want to go to hell, right? I was baptized as an insurance policy for the afterlife. Years later, and this is maybe me showing a little bit of my Anabaptist streak, I experienced baptism again. But the second time I experienced baptism, I didn't expect to experience it. And it was in the meltwater of Grinnell Glacier in Glacier National Park. Has anyone been to Glacier National Park or Grinnell Glacier? Grinnell Glacier is one of the most beautiful glacier hikes you can do in the national park. And so a few friends and I traveled there. We traveled there, and we did this hike, and it was something of a pilgrimage. I wanted to go to Glacier National Park to see these glaciers that are disappearing. The Kootenai people call Glacier National Park, it's the land before it was Glacier National Park, the place where there is a lot of ice. It's a name that the land will keep even long after the ice is gone. And the ice is disappearing quickly. It's estimated that by 2100, 2/3 of the world's glaciers will be killed. And that includes most of the glaciers in Glacier National Park. So standing at the edge of the glacial tarn, the water there, and here's some images of how Glacier National Park has changed over the course of the last 70 years. The water was milky blue, it was delicious, and as boys and young men in our 20s, we decided to jump in, and it was probably something masculine that I didn't have time to interrogate at the time, but it was fun and we jumped in. But I decided to go in a second time after that initial jump. And the second time I stayed about as long as my body could bear it, which was no longer than about 30 seconds. It was very cold. But I felt in that moment that I was being baptized by a dying glacier. That this ancient glacial priest held me and lowered me into these waters of our climate-changed world. And that when I came up from those waters, I was gasping for air, not just because I was cold and the water was cold, but because something in me had opened. That baptism wasn't a preparation for another world. That baptism to me was a rebirth into my love of this world. In that moment, baptism stopped being about individual salvation, and it became to me about solidarity with creation, with these waters that are warming, with creatures that are disappearing, with landscapes that are bearing the weight of human sin and human neglect. Baptism is God's way of saying, I am not done with you, and I am not done with this place. The book of Revelation takes the promise of baptism and stretches it to its fullest scope. It asks what it would mean for the whole world, not just for individual souls, to be baptized, healed, and made new. So now, having stood in the river with Jesus and in the waters of the wounded world, we turn to the final vision of Scripture in Revelation 21. When many of us hear the word revelation, we probably imagine escape, destruction of the world, maybe a great evacuation plan for the faithful. It's great that your speaker next week is coming to talk about all this. Hopefully I can cue her up a little bit. But Revelation is not about destruction of the world or its abandonment. It's about disclosure. The Greek word apocalypsis, which Revelation is apocalyptic literature, so the word apocalypsis means unveiling. It's the removal of a lens that distorts reality. And so Revelation 21 and 22 offer not an ending to creation, but creation's completion. John doesn't see souls floating upward into a heaven, but John sees a vision, similar to the vision of the prophets, of a city coming down. And this directionality matters. God does not pull creation away from itself toward God. God comes home to creation. As we read here, see, the home of God is among mortals. And this is the fulfillment of the story we've been tracing all along. The Garden of Genesis becomes the city of Revelation. The river returns, unpolluted, clear as crystal. Trees appear again. The tree of life reappears in Revelation, and the leaves of the tree of life is for the healing of the nations. Nothing is discarded, nothing is replaced, and everything is healed. And the God who created ex amore out of love, the God who rested in creation, comes to make a home among mortals. Revelation is a counter story to Empire. It's a story, it was written under the shadow of Rome, and it refuses the lie that violence, extraction, and domination are the final architects of history. Instead, Revelation imagines an oikos, a household ordered by love instead of scarcity. It portrays God as faithful not only to humanity, but to the whole covenant of creation. It echoes the prophets here too, that evil is not redeemed, but the earth is not destroyed, but the destroyers of the earth are destroyed, and creation is restored. This is why Revelation is not about escape. It's not escapist. It's demanding. It's apocalyptic in that literal sense. And it insists that the future God promises presses in on the present we inhabit. It asks, what would it mean to live now as if all of this were true? Revelation gives us new sight. And so we come back to where we began, with lenses. Creation justice is not first a strategy or a set of policies, though it certainly has implications for both. Creation justice is a way of seeing. It's a long, patient, sometimes painful retraining of our vision. Genesis teaches us that creation is good. Jeremiah teaches us to tell the truth whenever that goodness is violated. Baptism teaches us to enter the waters anyway, to consent to grief and hope with our bodies. Revelation teaches us that God has not given up on this world, and neither should we. And to see the world as creation is to believe that God is still at work here, still dwelling, still healing, still drawing all things toward wholeness. To see the world as creation is to live as if the future God promises is already tugging at the present. So the question before us is not whether hope exists. The question is, what lens will we choose to live by? Will we choose lens 1, the world as a warehouse or a wasteland, as something to use up or walk away from? Or lens 2, the world as creation, the world as God's household, as a place still capable of bearing the glory of God. This work of faith, the work of creation justice, is to keep choosing the clearer lens again and again and again, even when our eyes ache. Thank you.
I never turned it off. You did.
is a different one. Yeah, I know. Okay.
There we go. All right, we have time for a couple of quick questions. Raise your hand, I'll get the microphone to you. Here we go. Chuck.
Avery, tell us more about your organization.
Yeah.
What do you and your people do every day?
Yeah.
What are your objectives? What have been your successes? What have been your failures?
Be glad to, yeah. And I know I wouldn't have a lot of time to get into that here, so I encourage you to go visit us online and join us. You can scan the QR code here. So our work really falls into three categories: educate, equip, and mobilize. So under our work of education, we create theological resources and educational resources for churches to use. We have one coming out this week. We have an annual resource that comes out every year that's often used around Earth Day. It's called The Canopy of Creation, Trees and the Work of Justice. And it's about urban forestry and trees as agents in justice. So helping churches to do the work of creation justice education from the pulpit or from the Bible study or from the pews, wherever it is. Equipping, we offer trainings for congregational leaders, for clergy, and for lay leaders within a congregation to lead more effectively in a time of climate change and to bring creation justice efforts into their congregation. One of my favorite programs around this right now is called Eco Preacher, and it's a cohort of, we have 120 preachers right now who come together once a month and hone the craft of preaching well on creation justice. And then the third piece of our work is mobilizing. We are based out of DC. We've had an office there for all of our existence, and we try and provide a faithful voice for creation justice on Capitol Hill. That's just a little bit.
All right. Other questions? Yeah, Mark.
So these days, it's such a hard thing for I assume that you're a private nonprofit. What are some of the avenues of funding for your program?
Yeah. So we're funded mostly through gifts from private foundations and from individual givers. So there's a lot of my work as executive director is ensuring that our work is funded. And so we have some really generous support from private foundations, but also faithful people who give a little or a lot to support our work. We get a little bit of support from our denominational members, but as you all probably know, denominational budgets are also shrinking. And so we're trying to fill in the gaps that the denominations once filled in with gifts from individuals.
Anything else?
And if you want to give to Creation Justice Ministries, you can give at creationjustice.org/donate.
Yeah.
Get a lovely letter.
QR code. There you go. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I just was wondering, when we come to church, of course, there's a lot of paper, a lot of cups. Is that part of the ministry to get churches to be able to recycle, do the best with what goes on in the church?
Yeah. You know, the way that we approach this is asking the leaders from the church, what are the gifts of your church, and how can you turn those towards creation justice? And that looks like a lot of different things. Some will, preach from the pulpit every Sunday, something about creation justice. Some will, plant a native plant garden in their yard. Some will put solar panels up on the roof. Some will, make sure to get rid of the styrofoam or the paper cups at coffee hour. What we try to do is kind of create the space for the internal transformation in the culture of the church, so that it's not just doing the action for the sake of action, but that it's taking these really good, faithful actions like getting disposables out of coffee hour as an expression of faith. Because we think that if it's part of the church culture, it's going to be a lot more enduring than if it's just, we removed these because we wanted to.
All right. Oh, way over there. All right. Oh, and Ronnie too. Okay, I'm going to go here first, then I'll go there. I'm going to have to start jogging.
How is your, how are you being received now by the present administration?
Yeah. Well, there have been a lot of environmental rollbacks. There have been a lot of environmental rollbacks. So a lot of our advocacy work is fighting to protect bedrock environmental laws, ensuring that the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the waters of the U.S. Are preserved so that we have access to beautiful waters. I testified at a hearing at the EPA last year around the rollback of the waters of the U.S. And the testimony that I brought was, I have a creek that runs through my backyard in Durham, North Carolina. And under the new rules that were proposed, that creek would no longer be protected from fertilizer runoff from pollution. And around that time, my wife and I had just started talking about having kids, starting a family. And I imagine my kids out there in the creek playing and finding fish and salamanders. And I shared with them that I lament that creek, that the water quality will be so bad that the kids wouldn't be able to go out there and learn to love creation in the way that I have with the waters. So that we're trying to communicate the depth of impact that this would have, and hoping that they'll hear us. Not great. Yeah, not great. I think for us, it's trying to show up and be faithful, provide public witness, but unfortunately, the rollbacks seem to keep coming.
Yeah. Ronnie?
You talked about your ecumenical reach. Can you bring that down to the local level and help us see how we might take our Green Church initiative and broaden it? I was a part of a group of people from different churches around here for a while, and we would meet on Zoom, once a month. It just never got off the ground.
Yeah.
So if you have any.
No, it's a great question, Ronnie. And the best thing that we can do is to find other people doing good work and to join up with them. There's a framework called watershed discipleship that an author named Ched Myers has that I really like, which is we have to come together with all of the churches in our watershed. If all of our actions, all of our pollution is flowing into the same body of water, then we should see this watershed as a place of discipleship for us to love and care for the creatures there. So that would be one place to start. Who are the churches that are in the same watershed as your church here? And then I would guess that they probably have Brawnies at their church too. Every church that I've encountered has at least one or two people who are really passionate and care about this and want to get involved. So find those folks, team up with them, see what they're up to learn from them, for them to learn from you. And then, I have found local groups of congregations acting together to be really effective. Some states have groups called Interfaith Power and Light, which are collaborations of congregations that get together to advocate for clean energy policy. Another is there's a group in the DC area actually called the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions that comes together to advocate at the county level to get county level changes for climate action. But I think the first thing is really like being ecumenical in the outreach, right? Which is just getting across getting out of our walls a little bit across our theological differences and approaching with a posture of humility to learn what folks are doing, and then seeing if there's something to build together. Yeah.
Avery, thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to all for coming this evening, and safe travels home.